Thank you very much for waiting, ladies and gentlemen. Since it is time to begin, we would like to begin the press conference. So we have Chairman Kurokawa, and we also have the witnesses from the Ministry of Emergency of Ukraine. We have Mr. Holosha, who is head of the Agency of Ukraine for the Exclusion Zone Management, and we have Mr. Tabacini, who is Deputy Director of Central Geographical Observatory, as well as Mr. Gola from the Deputy Director General of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. So after the Commission meeting, we would like to hold this press conference with simultaneous interpretations for Japanese, Russian, and English. So please prepare yourselves with the receiver sets. We will have a 30-minute press conference today. I'd like to first of all call upon the chairman, Professor Kurokawa, about his views concerning the Commission meeting today, and then we would like to entertain questions. During the 7th Commission meeting, we have heard from witnesses from the Agency of Ukraine for the Exclusion Zone Management, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and also other agencies. And we have talked about the aftermath and the countermeasures taken with regard to the accident in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which occurred in 1986. As has been explained, there was actually a fallout of the radioactive substances from the Chernobyl power plant. And also there are differences in terms of the specifics of the accident, but it has been categorized as a level 7 according to the INES, International Nuclear Event Scale. And therefore, there has been a large area fallout of the radioactive materials. And of course, this is a precedence to our example of the Fukushima nuclear power plant, which has given tremendous impact on the lives of the residents in the surrounding areas. And it has been a valuable experience for us to hear from those members who were directly involved in the countermeasures taken after the Chernobyl accident. And what has become clear after the 7th Commission meeting is that the witnesses have spoken about following points. First is that with regard to the health hazard and also the impact on the environment from the fallout of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident is still continuing today, even after 26 years have elapsed since the occurrence of the accident. With regard to radioactive exposure and human health management, in terms of Ukraine, in terms of bringing the accident under control, and in terms of workers involved in the decontamination, there were many people who suffered from radioactive exposure, and this is something that we should take note of. And there was a great deal of radioactive exposure amongst children, and also many diseases pertaining to thyroid glands. And many children in the days of the accident have come to adult age. And other than the thyroid glands, it is also considered that there is an impact on all bodies, all the organs of the human bodies. And there's also stress syndrome with regard to the evacuees and those who have been forced to resettle. They are suffering from psychological consequences. In terms of food products, there is a detailed accounting of the intake as well as other consequences for food products. And of course, this is valuable information for us here in Japan in order to cater to the aftermath of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. With regard to information disclosure, of course, there are lessons learned from the days of the former Soviet Union, and in Ukraine government, they have reconfirmed the importance of information disclosure. But Belclare, Seabelt, Curie, such units are very difficult for general citizens to understand. So we need information disclosure, which is easily understandable by the people. by the general citizens. And of course, that is another focal point that we should keep in mind. In terms of international cooperation, in terms of the future of Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident, we should try to gather wisdom from extensive circles based on international perspective. At the end of April, we will go directly to Ukraine and Belarus and also Ukraine and Russia, so that we will be able to hear and actually visit directly with regard to the sites of accident. Concerning the Commission, with regard to the nuclear power plant accident, which has been triggered by the great earthquake and tsunamis, many of the problems which have emerged are still unresolved today, and various serious consequences with regard to the future. So the Commission, from an independent perspective, will compile a final report, which will come up in the month of June. In the previous Commission meeting, we have also reported to the members of the press that in the case of the Independent Investigation Commission, we have obtained a cooperation from those who have been forced to evacuate, and we conducted questionnaire surveys with the collaboration of the municipalities which have been affected. And 20,000 households from surrounding areas of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, we have sent a questionnaire surveys, and we have already responded 3,200, more than 3,200 responses as of March 6th. And the evacuees are still suffering as we speak today. And Mr. Michiko Tanaka raised a question in the previous Commission meeting, and looking at the video conference of TEPCO, and we have received many questions. And so I want to provide a comment with regard to the video recording. The Independent Investigation Commission has asked for watching the video in the within the site of TEPCO, because we felt that this is necessary for our investigative purposes. So we would like to look at the overall situation in order to prevent the recurrence of the accident. For those records which we feel are necessary in terms of preventing future recurrence of the accidents, we would like to attach them to the report from the Independent Investigation Commission. And if entities, if they refuse actually to provide such a record, we will try to exercise the right of the member to investigate matters of government, amongst others, for the entity to submit that record. And so this commission is conducting our investigation from an independent perspective, which is separate from the investigation committee, which is under the auspices of the government. So much for my remarks. We do have 3 witnesses for our guests, so we'll be very happy to entertain questions. So we will be happy to receive questions from the floor. Those of you with questions, please raise your hand, and we will bring the microphone to you. Please state your name and affiliation, and state your question. So as Chairman Kurokawa has introduced, we have experts from Ukraine today with us. So any of you with questions, please raise your hand. Yes, gentleman in the front. Ishikawa from NHK. I have a question for the witnesses from Ukraine. Concerning your children's thyroid gland exposure to the radiation, what about the channel of the exposure to the radiation? Is that from breathing, or is it from food products? And in Ukraine, because of the secret approach taken by the Soviet government, the iodine to prevent the stabilization of radiation in the thyroid glands were not distributed. And is that true? And this stabilization iodine, if this has been introduced, or do you think it would have been possible to prevent large number of occurrences of syndromes concerning the thyroid glands? So I would very much appreciate information regarding this.
To say shortly, I can say yes. If we have prophylactics with iodine, but we didn't have preparates of iodine for children on the territory of Ukraine, and it was dispersed, the iodine, only when air masses carrying radioactive ion already passed the territory of Ukraine, so it was late, basically. If, of course, the iodine was given several hours prior to the effect of the iodine radioactive cloud, that, of course, would help substantially. But there was also a second way, and which were predetermined the dose of radiation for prepaid children. For those who live in the satellite city from they had a big dose because of inhalation way. They inhaled a lot of air. For the children of contaminated, there are two ways only. For example, territory of Zhytomyr region, that was through foodstuff, milk, leafy vegetables. They all contained at first high concentration of radioactive iodine, and so there was a buildup of iodine in thyroid gland of doses on the Narodnichesky district, which was about over 100 kilometers from Chernobyl NPP, reached 3 grade for children. Of course, the morbidity level was very high.
May I? It's a follow-up. So what you're saying is that in the Ukraine, depending on the region, the level of radiation among the children vary in terms of the path or the route of radiation. Do you have such data? Do you have the data pertaining to the different path followed for the radiation intake by the children in different regions of Ukraine?
Of course, we have data. We have scientific institutions dealing with this problem from 1986. They're calculating the levels of radiation by all possible means, by all efforts. We shouldn't forget that there is one more nuance. In Ukraine, in Polessia, it is territory which is geochemically deprived of iodine, of stable iodine. That's why the level of damage for children who have lack of natural iodine is higher than other territories. Epidemiological studies are being conducted currently, but it should be said that today children don't get radiation. Irradiation happened in 1986. By 1st of August, radioactive iodine basically disappeared from ecological, and afterwards we're just monitoring the after effects of the irradiation in that period up to August of 1986.
I hope that answers the question. Any further questions? This gentleman over here. Fujita, freelance journalist. 26 years have elapsed since the accident, and the amount of the radiation has been reduced substantially. But in the forests in the no-go zone, in the exclusion zone, many animals have returned, according to what I have heard. And the low dose exposure, what is the impact on human body? What is the amount of the scientific findings that you have in Ukraine?
Thank you for the question. Of course, radiation affects live cells. It doesn't depend whether it's human or animal. It's understandable. Speaking about effect on animals, those research which was being conducted in the most contaminated evacuation zone, where there is no population close to Chernobyl NPP, there are quite a lot of research being conducted, interesting results being achieved. In general, the situation is, of course, supports the idea that there are high levels of radiation. They cause a big effect on animal organisms, but we also should understand that in the animal kingdom, when animal's body weakens, he becomes a victim of predators. So oncological diseases won't happen. So by natural way disappears, being hunted down by predators. The same happens on soil, in water. The same process happens. So we don't see oncological device. The short answer: yes, there is influence on animal. But the long-term effects cannot be monitored, unfortunately, because that doesn't happen that long ago.
Do you have an additional question? So what you're saying is that even if it's low dosage exposure, there is no such thing as safe dosage or safe exposure. That's what you're saying.
There is scientifically acknowledged worldwide model of radiation, influence of radiation on the body. Majority of scientists believe that from the point of view of effects of radiation on cell, there is no small dose, small effects, big dose, big effects. So that's a prevailing point of view. Some scientists believe that there is some kind of low-level ethanol benchmark, but we believe in the linear correlation between radiation and effect on cell.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? A gentleman in the beige jacket. Miyajima from Factor, monthly magazine. I have a question for Mr. Holosha. So you have the Ministry of Emergency of Ukraine. What is the authority as well as the size of the organization of this ministry? So could you give specific information with regard to this? It is the Ministry of Emergency, meaning that when there are nuclear power plant accidents in Ukraine sometime in the future, which we hope will never happen. Mr. Holosha, you will exercise your leadership. What is the relationship between then you, Mr. Holosha, head of the Ministry of Emergency, and the government of Ukraine? What about the police and the military and the firefighters? Mr. Holosha, will you be able to take the leadership vis-à-vis such organizations as well? Could you explain the organization of the Ministry of Emergency of Ukraine, please?
It's a many-faceted question. Thank you for that. Situation is following now, currently. In the first moments after accident, radiological accident, nuclear accident, which happened in Chernobyl, in Ukraine there was a separate ministry which dealt with liquidation of effects of accident. In the parliament there was a separate committee which dealt with the problems of purely Chernobyl catastrophe. In the state budget there was a special fund for liquidation of consequences of, it was beginning of 90s. That was acute period when the scale was still very big and large. Afterwards, in the Ministry of Chernobyl and structure with civil defense, we were united in the Ministry of External Situation. Now, the situation again became different, and it looks like Ministry of External Situation and Minister, they coordinate the other central organ of executive power, state agency for exclusion zone management. It's a judicial phase. It coordinates from ministry, and policy is being conducted with the liquidation of in the parliament. Apart from ecological function, committee has also function of liquidating. So one committee in parliament also has, and budget allocates money for liquidation of that's speaking about Chernobyl problem. From the point of view of organizing reaction for the emergency situation, to the leader of state civil defense in the country is Prime Minister in Ukraine. But his deputy or right hand, he conducts all the headquarter job. It is done by Minister of Emergency. It does all the planning, prophylactics, reacting, and organizing so-called liquidation of effects of emergency.
Additional question? Well, you said that the Prime Minister will take the leadership. Now you also have the Minister. You have your Minister of Emergency that will take the initiative over other government agencies. So I would say that the Minister is maybe a former member of the military or someone who has experience in nuclear. What are the requirements based on which a certain person could serve as the Minister of Emergency?
That's a pretty complex question. There is an understanding that there are different scales of emergency situations. According to classifications, what we have in Ukraine, there are emergency situations of low level, which is confined with one object. Maybe it's an area scale, then regional scale, and there is a national scale. Like, for example, Chernobyl or Fukushima, it's a national level emergency. And in this, depending on what kind of emergency, whether it is a transport or water, fire, nuclear power station, chemical production, so there are different ministries, there are groups of operating groups which are including into their general operating system of the state. So depending on situation, these mechanisms will be put in action.
Any further questions? Nadao from Nico Nico Doga. Thank you very much for your contributions. Mr. Holosha and also Chairman Kurikawa, my question is addressed to the two of you. Here in Japan, at the time of the announcement of level 7 of international nuclear event scale, perhaps NISA made this announcement, explained this, and they tend to look at the events following up Chernobyl accident to try to predict what happens after the Fukushima accident. And Mr. Holosha, you were explaining the differences between the two accidents. How do you compare the size and the impact of the two accidents? And is there no point in making a direct comparison between the two accidents at this point in time?
In my report earlier, when we're thinking about these questions, I should mention that this regarding the level of INES 7 or whatever, and the accidents in Chernobyl and Fukushima has the highest level. So like INES 7 level. that scale of nuclear accidents. And but there are core differences between these two accidents and their consequences on the environment. I think I already mentioned that huge difference, main difference between these two types of accidents. But from our point of view, it's good for Japanese people that the situation on Fukushima is much easier on them than we had in Chernobyl. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, any comments? Well, I think it's very difficult to compare the two. But based on INUS, and I'm sure there were various discussions subsequently, but when you maybe as nuclear plant incidents increase, then maybe the grading itself needs to be adjusted going forward. So hearing the discussion today, the release of radioactive waste, I think in that regard the level is different. But generally speaking, since there is no other grade available, we have already reached the same stage in terms of INUS. So I think there were challenges pertaining to the transparency and the release and the expeditiousness of the release. And also, in the case of Fukushima, it wasn't just about earthquake. It involved tsunami. So I think there are some differences as well. Of course, there in terms of response to the issue, I think there were differences. I'm afraid we're running out of time.
So this may be the last question. Kino, freelance journalist. I have a question for our witnesses from Ukraine. There are two questions. First of all, making the judgment, criteria for making the judgment for evacuation. There may be stress out of evacuation which may exceed the stress from the radiation. Is that kind of judgment possible in Ukraine? And based on the past experience of Ukraine, in the future, if there's going to be a recurrence of a similar nuclear event, for instance, 20 millisievert, that is the IAEA exposure lower limit of the 20 to 100 millimeter annual sievert annual exposure. If there's going to be an area of 20 millisievert per annum, is evacuation going to be prioritized, or are the residents going to stay put within the zone and decontamination to be given priority? Based on the situation of the health hazards in Ukraine, I would appreciate hearing your opinion about this.
In general, in the radiological scientific world, there are recommendations regarding the levels, how much they're critical in order to make some measures. For example, evacuation, shelter, the product, the food stuff, etc. So for each event, we have a different dose area. Dose level. For example, as for evacuation, I'm talking about Ukraine, we have the regulations like that. So, for example, the evacuation decision would be made if the radiation is 50 millisieverts per year. If it's over 500, then it is compulsory evacuation. So this is all in regulations, whether it's on paper, but whether take decision make it, there are many other factors, but we have different levels, the scales for three different types of defense against their consequences: the evacuation, shelter, and relocation. And the prohibition of selling of products from the contaminated area. So each country, depending on their economical, social conditions, depending on the scale of their accident, or many other factors, may have choose different criteria. For example, in the USSR in 1986, the criteria for that, as I mentioned earlier, was 100 millisieverts per year. I'm sorry, I meant 1,000 millisieverts per year. 1,000. But nobody, of course, received that level of radiation. It was a recommendation of National Commission of the USSR as a possible admissible level of radiation. So let's say now, in each specific case, there is a mechanism of optimization. When a possible harm or damage could be compared to what action should be taken, and so the argument then would be that positive consequences, decisions must be made, as for economy, as a social and psychological aspects. And in each specific case, the decision would be different depending on the conditions of each specific accident. But we have recommendations like that.
I'm sorry, could I ask one related question, or we don't have time, so all right then, one related question then. What I wanted to ask, of course, evacuation is one thing, but in terms of, let's say, maybe 20 millisieverts over 1 year, over many years, under the current standards in the Ukraine, if there is going to be long-term exposure, I think your policy is to relocate. But is there a possibility whereby you may defer such relocation and allow people to stay under decontamination? Are there any localities within Ukraine which you allow people to stay on as long as there's decontamination?
In Ukraine now, we don't have areas where people can receive 20 millisieverts per year, except for new enter zone. If, let's say, they live just 1-2 kilometers from the damaged reactor. Well, except for no entry zone, there are no areas with such level of radiation. Even we think right now, as in theory, maybe there are levels like 5 millisieverts per year, but we always checking, we make analysis according to their dosimeter. They may have 10-15 millisieverts per year because they're of the consumption of the wood products like berries, mushrooms, etc., whether they or meat of wild boar. For example, that's a decision of each person whether to eat these berries or not, whether to eat mushrooms or not, whether to eat wild boar meat or not. He's not coming to any analysis. He's giving these products to analysis. He just eat them. We were witnessing the cases like that. There are people who made their own decisions. They knew, but they don't consider it's harmful. Maybe it's because of education or some other aspects, like, for example, disbelief of the scientific data. We don't know, but the only cases are those.
This is truly the final question. Suzuki from Asahi Shimbun. This is a follow-up to the last question. Questions addressed to the witnesses from Ukraine. In the Commission meeting concerning decontamination, you have really had an enormous budget of decontamination with regard to residential area surrounding Chernobyl power plant, but how there was not much result. In the case of Japan, in the area surrounding Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, the annual exposure should be below 1 millisievert per year, and the high-ranking government officials have announced this. What do you think about such policies of the Japanese government? And so, what is the degree of decontamination which shall be pursued?
So our view, our specialist view, who are taking part in this activation works in the contaminated area, is as follows. First of all, we must make a technical project. Technical project starts with our studying the special effects of radioactivity on that certain area. Then you have to decide which is the level of contamination in each area. What's the equipment situation within your house or within your area around your house, where your children are playing? What's going on with the area where food products being made? Only after these data results, we receive the results or data like that, then we can only make a decision on what's the level of radiation permissible. For example, the level of contamination is 100 per unit. Let's say, I'm just saying as an example. Is it a lot or not? For human body is a lot. For the wall, it's nothing. So how often the person is hitting this wall, whether we need to destroy this wall, but maybe if the person will touch this wall, what would be the dose of radiation additionally received by this person? Do we need equivalent of a dose budget in order to destroy this wall and create a new one? So, and this regards to each element, how much radiation would be bad for certain. For example, here we can take away soil. Maybe on this point we can just change the soil, or maybe we just need to change it completely or mix it with other soil. So that's or we just give up this soil at all. Whether we need chemical agents to get into the soil to stop this contamination, or what a person would receive from some kind of culture, for example, carrots or cabbages which are grown on this area, whether it will be over the level or not. Only after that we can decide what we will do with the soil. But through cabbage and potato, we will then have how many people will consume, how much radionuclides would be inside his body, and then the dose, what would be the dose. So without the data like that, important data like that, we cannot say here is 15 curie and we must take away the soil. But how often human come into this, or in what kind of production man is growing on this soil or whatever. So there is no direct recommendation in this case. So we in Ukraine, 1 curie of cesium we can have contaminated area. On the 15 curie area we can get the clean production. So in Japan you have to study all specific features of each soil and make some assessment in how much it can be. Maybe it would be too much. Big burden. Korostan city, I mentioned, 80,000 people. It's always 20 curie per square kilometers, while on the other was only 2. So this activation was made in the whole city. So when we receive $1 million for one person per 1 sievert. But if maybe there was only 20, only those areas would be decontaminated, then maybe our costs would be much lower. So you see, it's all depends on specifics. Well, speaking different, the criteria, the influence on the human health, it's a dose. But this dose he can receive only because of disactivation, but that, for example, he can get because of his behavior or maybe from different products brought from somewhere. As always should be analysis and of the whole specifics and the influence on the human body. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we'd like to conclude the press conference at this juncture. Thank you for your participation. Next meeting will take place in the end of March. When the dates are decided, we will inform you. Thank you very much for your attendance today.